question.
We're going to listen right now to Nicola Sturgeon. She is speaking in London about Brexit. She's going to be setting out what she calls a common-sense alternative to the UK government's Brexit plans.
Be a source of wisdom rather than anxiety. And that gives me a problem this morning. After all, I'm here to talk about Brexit. And any politician who talks about Brexit without a significant level of anxiety clearly doesn't have any wisdom. So that, I'm afraid, is a conundrum this morning. However, I will do my best to add some notes of hope and, who knows, perhaps even some words of wisdom in my remarks today. And let me say at the outset what a real pleasure it is to be able to do that in such a magnificent and, in many ways, appropriate setting. This room was designed by the Scottish architect Robert Adam, who, as many of you may know, also designed Bute House in Edinburgh, which is now, of course, the official residence of the First Minister. Robert Adam drew heavily on the lessons and traditions that he learned during his travels across Europe, and indeed this room was purpose-built as a venue for discussion and debate. And so, in some senses, it really does evoke the values of the European Enlightenment in which Scotland and this institution played such a proud part. These values continue to be reflected in the RSA's mission and exemplified in the work that you do. In fact, it is striking how many connections there are between the RSA's recent priorities and those of the Scottish Government on issues that range from mental health in schools to universal basic income to inclusive growth and support for fair work. So the RSA is in many ways an ideal host for a discussion about Brexit, an issue that will have profound implications for our economy, the shape of our society and our place in the world for many decades, indeed for many generations to come. Now, of course, in the interests of complete transparency, I should say that I come at the Brexit challenge from a very specific perspective, as does the government that I lead. We oppose Brexit, we strongly oppose Brexit and deeply regret it. Even now, our strong preference would be to remain in the EU. Scotland, after all, voted by 62% to 38% in favour of that outcome. However, since the vote took place, we have sought to recognise the result of the referendum across the whole of the UK, even if we don't always entirely understand it. And so for the last 2 years, we have put forward constructive suggestions on how Brexit might be implemented in a way that finds common ground rather than in a way that further deepens division. In fact, when the Scottish Government policy paper, Scotland's Place in Europe, was published in December 2016, it was, at that time, the first detailed set of proposals to be produced by any government in the UK. It preceded the Chequers White Paper by 19 months. It is fair to say, of course, that our proposals have not so far had the impact on the UK government that we would have wanted them to have. The UK, throughout these negotiations, has shown little inclination to pay serious heed to Scotland, or for that matter to Wales, London, or to the different regions of England. Indeed, one of the lessons from our experience of the last 2 years, which I suspect has not been lost on the Scottish people and which will be remembered in Scotland for a long time to come, is the stark contrast between the EU's treatment of independent nations and the UK's treatment of devolved nations. The European Union has supported Ireland and shown it nothing but solidarity as it confronts the challenges of Brexit. By contrast, the UK has dismissed and ignored Scotland's concerns. So looking at the UK government and the EU, it's fair to say that only one has looked like a genuine partnership of equals, and over the past 2 years, that has not been the UK. However, the Scottish Government is determined to continue to put forward constructive proposals and to exhaust all opportunities for compromise that would allow Scotland's interests to be protected. After all, the decisive moments of this phase of the negotiation are now upon us. Speculation, of course, is rife as to what will emerge from Brussels in the next few days. It's clear from developments yesterday, or rather the lack of developments yesterday, that tough issues still require to be resolved. Perhaps they will prove to be incapable of resolution, though we must all hope that that is not the case. But I believe we can see enough about the potential shape of any possible deal, should it emerge, to draw some conclusions at this stage and set out an alternative way forward. That is why the Scottish Government is publishing a further document today ahead of this week's EU Council, setting out again the case for compromise and common sense. Now, I make no apology for the fact that on many issues it reaffirms our existing position. After all, the Scottish Government's analysis over the past 2 years has largely been vindicated by events. Firstly, and very importantly, we still believe that continued membership of the EU would be the best outcome for both Scotland and the rest of the UK. Secondly, failing continued EU membership, we think that the UK as a whole should remain in both the customs union and the single market. Thirdly, if the UK Government is determined to pursue a more distant relationship with Europe, we have argued for 2 years now, reflecting, of course, the strong Remain vote in Scotland, that there should be the possibility of a differentiated approach which allows Scotland to remain in the European single market. And on that point, let me be clear in relation to Northern Ireland that we fully support the Good Friday Agreement and the maintenance of an invisible border. And so the SNP will do nothing to stand in the way of Northern Ireland achieving a special relationship to the EU if that is what is required. However, if that is the outcome, and I must stress this point, the case for Scotland having a similar arrangement to avoid us being placed at a severe economic disadvantage becomes even stronger. And fourthly and finally, given that none of these compromise options are guaranteed, we believe that when there is greater clarity about the terms of Brexit than exists today, Scotland must have the option to choose a different course as an independent member of the EU. Now, all of these points are important, but today, because of the critical stage we are reaching in the UK's negotiations with Europe, I want to focus in particular on the second of them. I will set out why, if the UK is determined to leave the EU, it should, in my view, remain in the customs union and single market. That, in my view, is the least damaging alternative option for the UK as a whole, as well as the least damaging option for Scotland. To make that point, I will first of all highlight the fact that the current option being pursued by the UK Government, the so-called Chequers proposal, is impractical, undesirable and undeliverable, and that whatever it is that the House of Commons comes to vote on later this year, it will not be the Chequers proposal. Indeed, if a withdrawal agreement can be reached, it will in all likelihood be accompanied by a very vague, probably highly fudged political declaration on the future relationship between the UK and the EU. It is my strong view that such a deal should be rejected, not in favour of no deal, as some will try to suggest, but as a way of getting a better deal back on the table. So I will then set out what I think is the real choice that the UK Government should be talking about, the trade-offs between a free trade agreement similar to the one that the EU has with Canada, or continued membership of the single market and customs union. And of those, customs union and single market membership is by some considerable distance the better option. And finally, and I'm well aware that this is the most difficult part of all, I will set out my thinking on how this option might yet be achievable, indeed why it might actually be the only option capable of commanding a House of Commons majority, and why the moment for getting to this decision could be emerging. But let me begin with the UK Government's current position. As most people here know, the UK and the EU are currently negotiating on two issues. The first, of course, is the withdrawal agreement. Now, there are a number of issues there that still require resolution, including governance arrangements and geographic indicators, an issue that is extremely important to Scotland. However, as everybody knows, the most vexed issue that needs to be resolved is how to maintain an open border on the island of Ireland. And of course, without a withdrawal agreement, there will be no transition period. And let me say at this stage, just as an aside, that I hope the withdrawal agreement, if it can be concluded, includes provision to extend the transition period beyond the end of 2020. If the last 2 years have shown us anything, it is surely that more time will inevitably be needed to agree the future relationship, and so being able to extend the transition period will be absolutely vital to avoid another cliff edge scenario. Second issue, of course, under negotiation is the political declaration that will accompany the withdrawal agreement. That will set out the framework that will determine the long-term relationship between the UK and the EU. And the long-term relationship is what I want to focus on today. At the moment, the UK government persists in saying that that should be based on the Chequers proposal, but there are no grounds whatsoever for believing that that will happen. And I think it is worth being crystal clear about this. When the EU rejected the Chequers proposals at Salzburg last month, the Prime Minister's subsequent statement tried to give the impression that some sort of ambush had taken place, that the rejection of these proposals was a complete shock. But anybody who was surprised by the substance of what was said at Salzburg can't have been paying very much attention to what the EU had been saying up until then. Indeed, that lack of attention in itself might provide a clue as to why the negotiations have been going quite so badly over recent months. And indeed, we see a similar phenomenon at play today, with the UK government expressing surprise at positions that have been articulated and held by the European Union now for quite some time. The UK government this morning expressing surprise that it is being held to a Northern Ireland backstop that it signed up to in December of last year. And you know, one of the casualties, and again this is an aside, but it is perhaps an important one, one of the casualties of this whole saga may actually prove to be the UK's international reputation as a trusted, reliable, good faith partner and negotiator. And that would indeed, I think, be tragic. However, Salzburg, even if it might have come as a shock to some, was useful, I think, in one way. The UK government has been trying to say that the only possible choices the UK has are the Chequers proposal or no deal at all. Salzburg showed beyond any reasonable doubt that that is simply not correct. It's incorrect because the EU was never likely to accept some of the key elements of Chequers. Chequers relies on the UK collecting tariffs on the EU's behalf through an untried set of bureaucratic and technological processes, and that formulation, I think, has been kind to the proposals. Even more fundamentally, by keeping free movement for goods but not for services or people, Chequers undermines the essential unity of the single market, and that has always been unacceptable to the EU. In addition, Chequers would be deeply damaging to the UK and indeed to the Scottish economy. I've just mentioned that it takes services out of the single market, and it's worth just dwelling on that point for a second. Services constitute 4/5 of the UK's economy and 2/5 of its exports going to the EU. The UK has a trade deficit with the EU in goods, but it has a trade surplus in services. Now, all of that means it makes absolutely no sense at all for us to leave the single market in services. It's a market that brings huge benefits and also has enormous potential for growth in the future. And finally, Chequers is unworkable because even if it was acceptable to the EU, which it's not, there appears to be no political majority for it at home. And yet the Prime Minister, even after Salzburg, maintains that Chequers is the, and I'm quoting her here, the only serious and credible option on the table. However, it is not a serious and credible option, and the only reason it's the only option on the table is because the UK government has refused to countenance any others. But let's be clear, and we should be clear about this. A head-in-the-sand approach will not make the Chequers ostrich fly. And so when it comes to a vote in the Commons later this year, it will not be Chequers that MPs are voting on. Now, of course, as of today, it remains to be seen if a withdrawal agreement can be reached. Alarmingly, it does seem increasingly doubtful that any deal can be struck that will satisfy both the EU 27 and those in the DUP and the Brexiteer wing of her own party that the Prime Minister is politically beholden to. If no withdrawal agreement is reached, the need to change course becomes all the more necessary and certainly all the more urgent. However, if a withdrawal agreement can be struck, I would expect the political declaration on the future relationship due to follow thereafter to lack precise detail, leaving both sides to interpret it in the way that suits them, but with no one knowing what it actually means, and with all of the hard issues that have defied resolution in the last 2 years simply being kicked into the long grass. That then raises the quite grim prospect of the UK leaving the EU next March with no idea whatsoever of what the future relationship will be. That scenario, often referred to as a blindfold Brexit, is in my view completely unacceptable. It would replace a no-deal Brexit with a no-detail Brexit. It would keep the public and businesses in the dark. It would leave the long-term position with the Irish border unresolved. It would require the House of Commons to vote on whether to accept a deal, despite there being no way of knowing what that deal will lead to in reality. And by delaying key decisions until after the UK has left the EU, the government will reduce its influence and diminish its status just before conducting the most important negotiations in its post-war history. And the cliff edge, no-deal scenario would not be avoided, it will simply be deferred. In my estimation, no responsible government should contemplate such a course of action. But this government is contemplating it, and its tactics are extremely clear. They will present with ever-increasing levels of desperation a completely false choice. The idea that the only alternative to a bad deal of the blindfold nature is no deal at all. It's actually quite breathtaking when you stop to consider that just for a second. The UK government has spent the last 2 years asserting that no deal is better than a bad deal, but they will almost certainly now try to railroad MPs into accepting a bad deal on the grounds that no deal will be a catastrophe. They're threatening us with fire to try to make us choose the frying pan. But MPs do not have to fall for that false choice, and I would argue that no self-respecting Parliament would fall for that false choice. The fact is that other options are available. The single market and customs union option that I have consistently argued for and will set out again today is one such option. A so-called people's vote, which I've said SNP MPs would support, even although it wouldn't necessarily protect Scotland from the same outcome as in 2016, is another such option. These alternative options, of course, may require more time and therefore may well necessitate a request to extend Article 50. But that surely must be preferable to pressing ahead in a reckless and damaging manner. And actually, that is the key point I want to make and indeed to stress this morning. Voting against a bad or a blindfold Brexit deal isn't a vote for no deal. It would be a vote for a better deal. Indeed, voting against a bad blindfold Brexit when the opportunity arises, if it does later this year, is the only chance the House of Commons will have to reset these negotiations and to think again before it is too late. In doing so, it would finally prompt an honest and open discussion about the real long-term choice that the UK faces if it is intent on leaving the EU and the genuine trade-offs that it involves. The hard fact is that leaving the EU, and this has actually been the case from the very start of this process, ultimately involves a choice between a Canada-style free trade agreement, which would be even more damaging than Chequers because it would make trading goods more difficult, or, on the other hand, membership of the single market and customs union. And that reality has to bite sooner or later. The head of the CBI spoke about a Canada-style agreement just a few weeks ago. She pointed out that it would be the first trade deal in history that increased barriers to trade rather than reduced them. It would lead to job losses, It would not solve the Irish border issue. By contrast, membership of the Single Market and Customs Union would end the current impasse in negotiations. It would guarantee an open border both on Ireland and across the Irish Sea, and it would be by far the better option for exporters of goods and services. Yes, it would enable continued free movement for workers, which, again, in the interests of complete transparency, is, in my view, both good and necessary, as it gives opportunities to individuals in Scotland and the UK to work overseas and allows businesses and public services to recruit from across the continent. But it would also still enable the UK to apply existing restrictions on rights of movement for people who aren't choosing to work or study. So for all of these reasons, it is by far the least damaging form of Brexit for the economy. And for Scotland, and I know for many others across these islands, it also speaks much more strongly to our European identity, to our desire to be a constructive partner to our neighbours across the continent. And although, as someone who voted Remain, I see Single Market and Customs Union membership as being second best to membership of the EU, for many people who voted to leave, it would surely be preferable to EU membership. The UK would, after all, have left the EU. There would be no sense of being part of a growing political union. The UK would no longer have to be part of the common agricultural and fisheries policies. And although divergence from EU rules and regulations would certainly have consequences, this approach would leave Westminster with the final say in whether particular single market rules applied here in the UK. Now, in saying all of this, I am acutely aware that so far the UK government has been consistent in its rejection of membership of the Single Market and Customs Union. But that's for two related reasons, neither of which stand up to much scrutiny. The first is that it has established red lines in these negotiations, such as ending free movement of people and being able to sign independent trade deals. But these red lines contradict some of its other stated positions. In particular, the further away from Europe we are in terms of immigration and trade policy, the harder it will be to keep the Irish border open. And of course, the red lines themselves are completely self-imposed. They are not essential consequences of the referendum. Indeed, as I recall, the ability to sign trade deals was hardly an issue in the referendum. And that, I think, is an important point, because the second reason the UK government gives for its current stance is democratic legitimacy. The Prime Minister said after Salzburg that single market membership would make a mockery of the referendum. But in 2016, the winning side was not obliged to put forward a clear proposal. It put forward no proposal other than the famous lie on the side of the bus. So the referendum outcome was not a mandate for a hard Brexit. In fact, I would go further than that. It told us nothing about what sort of Brexit people might want. If it had done, it surely wouldn't have taken the UK government more than 2 years to even come up with the Chequers proposal. And, of course, in addition to that, 48% of voters voted to remain in the EU, so did 2 out of the 4 nations of the UK. So in that context, membership of the Single Market and Customs Union is surely the obvious democratic compromise. It is certainly, in my opinion, a better reflection of the referendum outcome than anything the UK government has so far proposed. Indeed, what is happening at the moment is quite extraordinary. The UK government is ploughing on with a strategy that it knows will reduce household incomes and cost jobs. It has appointed a minister for food supplies, for goodness sake, for the first time since the Second World War. Its own departmental notices are setting out plans to stockpile medicines. On Friday, it announced that the M26 was being adapted for use as a lorry park. It's having to do all of this only because it has chosen an extreme interpretation of the referendum result, while overlooking the obvious fact that whatever most people voted for, it surely wasn't where we are right now. Now, that stance, in my view, is the one, actually, that makes a mockery not just of the referendum result, but of basic common sense. It's not justified on democratic grounds, and it should not be countenanced on economic grounds. But of course, in many ways, diagnosing these issues and these problems is relatively straightforward. The harder part is answering the fundamental question, where do we go from here? After all, the Prime Minister and her government's rhetoric over the last 2 years has put it in a tight, awkward position. Any move now to accept single market and customs union membership is likely to be seen as a climb down rather than a compromise. I understand that, but fundamentally that is a problem of the government's own making. It should not and must not stand in the way of the wider public interest. And of course, in the weeks ahead, it won't simply be the government that has to make important decisions. A heavy responsibility, a very heavy responsibility, will also rest with Parliament and with individual MPs. For MPs to support a bad or a blindfold Brexit, a cobbled-together withdrawal agreement and a vague statement about our future relationship would, in my view, be a real dereliction of duty. So what happens then if they reject that and instead force an honest discussion about a Canada-style deal or continued free trade and customs union membership? Well, it seems to me impossible, absolutely impossible, to envisage a Westminster majority for a Canada-style deal. The Labour Party has said that it would vote against such an outcome. The SNP certainly would. A few weeks ago, Amber Rudd said that 40 Tory MPs would vote against that outcome as well. In fact, in these circumstances, it is probably the case that the only option with any chance of commanding a parliamentary majority is single market and customs union membership. Now, I'm not saying at all that the way to such a solution would be easy, but it actually might well be the only option which is not completely impossible at this stage. It should be acceptable to the European Union. It avoids the worst economic damage that Brexit will do. It resolves the Irish border issue, and it does come closest to reconciling the different views of Leavers and Remainers. And while it is an outcome that might still look some distance away, it is not unachievable. What it requires is common sense and a willingness to compromise. And it's worth adding at this point that a willingness to compromise when it comes to the UK government cannot simply be an attempt to find the centre of gravity between the most vocal elements of the Tory party, or even between the Tory party and the DUP. It must instead be a genuine attempt to find some common ground across what is currently a divided Parliament and a divided UK. Now, I'm prepared to play my part in that. After all, I am First Minister of a country which voted by 62% to 38% to remain in the EU. However, as we have made clear for 2 years now, the Scottish Government, albeit with a heavy heart, would support an outcome that secures continued membership of the single market and customs union. In short, we have long demonstrated our willingness to compromise, and I think it's time that the UK Government did likewise. And as the crucial vote looms closer, it is also time for individual members of the House of Commons to consider what compromises they see as justified and which are not, if they are to serve their constituents and the wider public interest. If they do that, I do believe that a common sense outcome could yet be found. There is one final point I want to make. I mentioned earlier on that this room evokes Scotland's historic connections with Europe. It highlights the fact that Scotland is and always has been a European nation. Indeed, our European identity has strengthened in recent years. Next month marks the 20th anniversary of the passage of the Scotland Act, which paved the way for devolution and the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. And when that Act was being debated at Westminster, Donald Dewar, Scotland's First Minister, predicted that devolution would add a new dimension to Scotland's role in Europe. And his words have been proven to be absolutely right. In the past 20 years, Scotland, with the support of all political parties at Holyrood, has expanded its presence in Brussels. We have collaborated with partners on European projects, from renewable energy to healthy ageing. Our businesses and our universities have enjoyed ever greater benefits from our international ties. Scottish society has been enriched by the presence of more than 230,000 EU citizens from outside the UK. We've seen at first hand the benefits we gain from working with allies from across the continent. And so we are determined to work to enhance rather than diminish our ties with the EU. In the past 2 years alone, the Scottish Government has established new offices in Berlin, Dublin and Paris, here in London as well. Our enterprise agency has doubled its representation in Europe. And so even if the UK Government does opt for a hard Brexit, I'm determined that Scotland will do everything we can to ensure that our policies remain consistent with European priorities and values. You see, the basic ideal behind the EU, for all its imperfections, appeals to us. We like the idea of independent nations cooperating closely for the common good. And as we watch the Brexit fiasco unfold, the case for Scotland becoming one of those independent nations becomes ever stronger. But of course, whatever happens, we will always, first and foremost, seek to work closely and constructively with other nations on these islands. It is in all of our interests that we find a better approach to Brexit, one which avoids the worst economic harms of a hard Brexit and maintains the key benefits of free trade and the other ties that unite countries across Europe.
Nicola Sturgeon speaking in London about what she would like to see after Brexit. She pointed out several times that Scotland voted 62% for Remain, but she said the only option that can bring together Remainers and Leavers would be for the UK to stay in the customs union and the single market. She said that if MPs vote against a deal, it's the only way to reset the negotiations. Voting against a bad deal, she said, would not be a vote for no deal, but a vote to try a different approach. And she spoke about potentially extending all the deadlines to allow a different approach to proceed.